Divers have made quite a discovery off Nantucket Island in Massachusetts, the wreck of a German U-boat. A team of divers spent decades searching for it, and using sonar, they finally found the sub this week.
Researchers released these renderings of a German U-boat found on the seafloor just north of the country's coast.
2 divers died trying to uncover the secret of this lost Nazi submarine. When explorers finally entered the wreck, they found something far worse than a sunken warship. Human bones lay scattered across the control room. A violent blast had ripped open the steel hull, and buried deep in the silt was a small object that would expose a terrifying truth about the submarine, and how the crew's final hours became one of the most horrifying stories of World War II. The impossible submarine. Something was on the ocean floor 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, and nobody knew what it was. A fishing captain had been working that stretch of the Atlantic for years, but there was a particular set of coordinates he kept returning to. Something large was sitting on the seabed there. His sonar picked it up every time he passed over it. You see, it was not on any chart. It matched no known wreck. No official record acknowledged it existed. He had no explanation for it, and neither did anyone else. He mentioned it one evening to a wreck diver named Bill Nagel, almost as an afterthought. Nagel was not the kind to leave a mystery alone. So in September 1991, Nagel assembled a team of experienced technical divers, loaded the boat, and headed 60 miles out into the Atlantic toward those coordinates. The ocean was cold and gray that morning. When they arrived at the exact spot the captain had described, they cut the engine, dropped anchor, and lowered a depth line. The reading came back 230 feet to the bottom. That number sat over the boat like a warning nobody said out loud. At that depth, the light vanishes completely before the halfway point. The cold stops feeling like temperature and starts feeling like pressure, and the nitrogen in compressed air begins dissolving into the bloodstream, quietly dismantling the ability to think clearly, to feel afraid, to make decisions that keep a person alive. The dangerous part is that none of it feels dangerous while it is happening. Experienced divers know that feeling, and they dread it. Still, they suited up in silence and entered the water one by one. The pressure built against their chests and eardrums with every foot they dropped. After what felt like an eternity, the sandy bottom appeared beneath them, and Bill leveled out. The team settled around him in the darkness. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. He turned his torch forward into the black water ahead, and the beam caught something enormous. And a submarine sat upright on the sand. Not wreckage, not debris. A complete submarine sitting there as if it had simply decided to rest. He moved toward it slowly, and the full shape emerged from the darkness as he closed the distance. Every line of the structure, the tower, the hull, the visible deck fittings matched a German U-boat from the Second World War. He had dived on enough wrecks in his life to know exactly what he was looking at. What he could not understand was why it was here. The rest of the team descended and circled the wreck without a word passing between them. The vessel sat level on the sand, settled gently into it as if it had been lowered carefully into position, and left there. Some of the hatches still appeared sealed. Then a diver's torch swept across a section near the control room and stopped, while a large portion of the hull had been torn open. The metal around it bent violently inward, as if something had driven itself through the steel from outside. Something had struck this submarine with devastating force. But that question would have to wait, because when the torch beam continued across the sand just beyond that torn section, it caught something white against the dark seabed. Human bones lay near the opening, small, pale, completely still against the dark sand. Nobody moved. These were not the abstract remains of a historical event. These were men who had loved ones somewhere on land, who had never come home, and whose families had never been told exactly why. But there was something else, something that made the whole scene feel not just tragic, but deliberately strange. And the divers searched the exterior for identification markings. German submarines were built with serial numbers and metal tags stamped into equipment throughout the vessel. Standard military practice. Those markings existed precisely so that a wreck could be identified decades later. This submarine had none. Every plate, every marking gone. The divers surfaced and started making calls. They contacted the Naval Historical Center in Washington. They reached out to naval historians and military record offices. They expected confusion, maybe some excitement. What they received instead was the same answer from every single source. There was no record of any German submarine lost near New Jersey. Word about the discovery traveled fast through the wreck diving community along the East Coast. Experienced technical divers began planning expeditions to the coordinates. Everyone wanted to be the one to solve it. Among those drawn into the obsession were a father and son from rural Pennsylvania. Chris Rouse and his 22-year-old son Chrissy had built a reputation along the East Coast as one of the most fearless diving teams anyone had seen. They had heard about the wreck. They had studied everything known about it. And one morning they decided it was their turn to go down. Their story would take the most tragic turn ever, the wreck that started killing. On the morning of October 12, 1992, Chris Rouse stood on the deck of the dive boat named Seeker and stared at the Atlantic Ocean. The water looked violent and dark. Strong waves rolled under the boat. Had Chris watched the sea for a long moment and said something that surprised the people around him. He said he felt uneasy about the dive. His son Chrissy stood beside him and looked at the same water. Chrissy felt the same thing. The conditions were rough. Most divers would have turned around at that moment, but Chris and Chrissy decided to dive anyway. But before they even entered the water, there was already something deeply wrong with this dive. A dive to 230 feet required a special breathing gas called trimix. Trimix reduces the dangerous effects that nitrogen causes in the brain at extreme depths. It allows divers to think clearly and make careful decisions underwater. Chris and Chrissy did not have trimix. Trimix tanks were extremely expensive. Each tank could cost many times more than a normal air tank. Yet Chris and Chrissy could not afford them. So the two men clipped on ordinary air tanks. They prepared to dive 230 feet on breathing gas that would slowly poison their thinking. The men stepped to the edge of the boat and jumped into the Atlantic. Cold water closed over their heads as they began their descent. In time, the submarine appeared below them. The wreck sat on the seabed exactly where earlier divers had described it. Chrissy had a goal inside the submarine. During a previous dive, he had seen something near the galley. The object looked like an artifact with German writing. Chrissy believed the artifact could finally reveal the submarine's identity. He swam toward an open hatch. He fed a guideline through the entrance and pulled himself into the wreck. Inside the submarine, the water felt thick and suffocating. Decades of fine silt covered every surface. Each small movement sent clouds of gray sediment rising into the water. The clouds quickly turned the interior into complete darkness. Chrissy continued moving deeper through the wreck. He located the artifact and began digging around it. The object lay partly buried beneath a folded rubber life raft that had not moved since the war. Chrissy worked quickly. Meanwhile, something terrifying was already happening. The nitrogen in his brain made him feel sharp and confident, but his mind told him to keep going. When Chrissy pulled hard enough, the raft suddenly shifted. The debris around it shifted. The corroded metal structures above him that had been leaning against each other since the war shifted. Then they came down. A massive section of the submarine's interior collapsed and drove Chrissy Rouse into the floor of the wreck. The steel pinned him flat. He could not move his legs. He could not push the weight above him. He was faced down in the silt of a World War II submarine at 230 feet in complete darkness, completely alone, with his air draining faster with every panicked breath. His air supply drained faster with every breath. Outside the wreck, his father waited and watched the guideline. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Chris knew then that something had gone terribly wrong with his son. Quickly, he swam into the submarine. Inside the wreck, he found Chrissy trapped beneath the fallen metal. He immediately began tearing at the wreckage with his bare hands. He pulled at rusted metal that had been frozen in place for 50 years. And his hands scraped and bled against sharp steel. Finally, the wreckage shifted, and Chris freed his son. They looked at each other again in the darkness, and both of them knew immediately that something was still very wrong. They checked their gauges. They checked the time. They were 31 minutes past their planned bottom time. The nitrogen saturating every cell in their bodies had reached levels that made safe ascent nearly impossible. To survive, they needed to ascend in slow, precise stages, pausing at specific depths for specific amounts of time, sometimes hours, allowing the nitrogen to seep gradually out of their tissue and blood. Skip those stops, and the nitrogen expands violently inside the body as pressure drops, tearing through blood vessels, joints, the spinal cord, the brain. As like thousands of tiny explosions happening simultaneously from the inside out. But before they even got the chance to do that, Chris did something that immediately put them in great danger. Then Chrissy inhaled water through his regulator. One breath, that was all it took. The cold water hit his lungs, and whatever the nitrogen had left of his rational mind vanished completely. At that point, the only thing he could think was to ascend as quickly as he could. So he kicked upward with everything he had. Chris watched his son shoot toward the darkness above them. He had 3 seconds to decide: ascend slowly and survive, or follow his son and face whatever was coming together. He kicked upward. They shot from 230 feet to the surface without stopping at a single decompression point. As the pressure dropped around them, as the nitrogen dissolved in their blood had nowhere to go, it expanded violently inside their bodies. Bubbles tore through their joints, their spinal cords, their brains. From the inside out, they were being destroyed. They broke the surface after 41 minutes. Chris could not move his arms. His eyes were open and empty. The crew started CPR on the pitching deck 60 miles from the nearest hospital. His heart stopped 20 minutes later. He died at sea on the boat with his son still alive somewhere above him in a Coast Guard helicopter. Chrissy was airlifted to a hyperbaric chamber. It is a sealed, pressurized room that recreates the crushing pressure of deep water on land, the only machine in existence that can force nitrogen bubbles back into the blood before they finish destroying a person from the inside. He was conscious when he arrived. That he could speak. He told the doctors everything that had happened inside the submarine. Then he told them something that stopped the room cold. He said that while he lay pinned under the steel in total darkness, he had heard jungle drums. He said he believed a monster was coming to eat him. The nitrogen had stolen his mind so completely that his brain had abandoned him at the moment he needed it most. When the doctors began recompression treatment, the pain became unbearable. Chrissy lost consciousness. His heart stopped. A father and his son were gone. The submarine still had no name, and Bill Nagel's team were already planning their next descent where they would make more shocking discoveries. The disturbing evidence inside the submarine. Bill Nagel's team returned to the wreck with a very different mindset. The earlier dive had changed everything. 2 experienced divers had just died exploring the submarine. The mystery now felt darker. Still, the divers went back down. They descended again through the cold Atlantic water until their lights swept across the steel shape resting on the sand. The submarine looked exactly the same as before. But the moment the divers entered the submarine, the scene changed. Inside the control room area, where they hadn't explored before, they found human remains. But these remains were quite different from any they had seen on the sub. The bones did not lie where sailors normally died during a submarine disaster. In many wrecks, skeletons remained near control stations or equipment panels. Sailors found exactly where they stood when everything ended. This wreck looked different. Bones were scattered across the compartment. Some lay in corners. Some were trapped beneath twisted pieces of equipment. One skull had become wedged between steel structures. Other bones had slid beneath collapsed panels and debris. The pattern told a violent story. Something had thrown these bodies across the room with tremendous force. Divers began studying the interior more carefully. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing the scene became. Heavy equipment had been ripped loose from its mounting points. Control instruments hung at strange angles. Metal panels had bent inward toward the center of the submarine. The wreck did not look like a vessel that had slowly flooded. It looked like something had exploded. Inside a submarine, an explosion behaves differently than it does in open air. The steel hull forms a narrow, sealed tube. When a blast strikes that tube, the shockwave cannot escape. The pressure wave travels through every passageway, every equipment room, every crew space. The air inside compresses violently. The sudden pressure can rupture lungs and burst blood vessels without leaving a visible mark on the body. The divers saw evidence of this kind of destruction everywhere around them. The crew inside that submarine would have had almost no warning. The shockwave would have slammed through the narrow interior of the submarine like a hammer inside a steel pipe. Sailors standing only a few feet apart could have been thrown in different directions within a fraction of a second. Some would have died instantly. Others may have been thrown against equipment or bulkheads by the force of the blast. The wreck also revealed another strange detail. Many personal items still rested where sailors had left them. Shoes, dishes, and small pieces of uniform fabric lay scattered across the floor, the kind of objects that belonged to people living normal daily routines. Then something catastrophic had happened. With almost no time to react, the divers returned to the large hole near the control room that they had noticed during earlier dives. This time, they studied it much more closely. Their lights revealed that the steel around the opening had not simply cracked from pressure. Thick metal plates had been torn open and pushed inward toward the inside of the submarine. The damage looked as if something had struck the hull from the outside and exploded directly into the control room. This detail was very important. During World War II, warships hunted submarines using a weapon called a depth charge. A depth charge is a large explosive barrel that ships dropped into the water above a submarine. The weapon sank to a set depth and then exploded underwater. The explosion created a powerful shockwave in the water that slammed into the submarine's hull. Depth charges did not hit submarines directly. Instead, they exploded nearby and crushed the hull with pressure from the outside. The hole in this submarine did not look like that at all. The damage was focused in one exact spot. The steel showed clear signs that something had struck the hull directly and then exploded. During World War II, only one weapon created that kind of damage: a torpedo. German submarines carried torpedoes as their main weapon. They used them to attack cargo ships, destroyers, and convoys across the Atlantic. But that fact only made the mystery worse. Historians searched the war records looking for the attack that destroyed the submarine. They expected to find a destroyer report, an aircraft strike, or a naval patrol claiming the kill. Instead, they found nothing. No Allied ship had reported firing a torpedo near the New Jersey coast. No aircraft had attacked a submarine in that area. The records were silent. For years, the mystery remained frozen on the ocean floor, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Then, during another new dive deep inside the wreck, a diver, John Chatterton, found something small buried in the silt. It looked ordinary at first, but that single object was about to change the entire story of this submarine. The knife with a dead man's name. Yet John Chatterton refused to walk away from the wreck. He had been there from the very beginning. On September 2, 1991, he descended with Bill Nagel's team and saw the submarine resting on the sand. He watched the mystery grow darker with every dive. Divers had already died exploring it. Yet, the submarine still had no name. The diving community slowly moved on, and many accepted that the submarine might never be identified. Bill Nagel, the man who had led the discovery team, became seriously ill and was dying. Expeditions to the wreck slowed down, but Chatterton did not stop. He and another diver named Richie Kohler kept returning to the wreck year after year. They were looking for one thing: a name. The first real clue appeared early. On November 6, 1991, only weeks after the first discovery dive, Chatterton opened a drawer inside the submarine. Inside, he found a stainless steel dinner knife. The knife had a wooden handle. Someone had carved a name into that handle by hand. Small personal act from a man who had lived and worked inside that submarine. The name said Henberg. Chatterton brought the knife to the surface and began searching German naval records. The archives confirmed something shocking. A sailor named Martin Henberg had served aboard a German submarine called U-869, but the records said something else. U-869 had been destroyed near Gibraltar thousands of miles away. Historians told Chatterton the knife could not prove anything. They believed Henberg had probably been transferred to another submarine before the war ended. Records from the final months of the war were incomplete. The knife might simply belong to another vessel. And so Chatterton put the knife away and kept diving. 3 more years passed, dive after dive, season after season. He and Kohler continued searching a submarine that had already killed people trying to explore it. Then, on August 31st, 1997, everything changed. Chatterton entered the electric motor room near the rear of the submarine. In the silt, he saw a small wooden box. Attached to that box was a plastic identification tag. The tag was only a few inches long, but the letters stamped into it had survived 50 years underwater. The tag read U-869. That was it, a 3-inch piece of plastic. That was what 6 years, 2 deaths, and dozens of dives into one of the most dangerous wreck sites on the East Coast had been building toward. Chatterton surfaced with it, and the mystery that had consumed the better part of a decade finally had its answer. The wreck off New Jersey was U-869. 6 years of searching ended in that moment, but that discovery created a terrifying new problem. Every official record said U-869 had been destroyed near Gibraltar, which meant the records were wrong. For more than 50 years, historians had believed the submarine lay in the eastern Atlantic near Africa. Families of the crew had mourned their loved ones in the wrong place. Memorial records listed the wrong ocean. The submarine had actually died off the American coast. Then, something none of the divers had anticipated happened. In 1999, a documentary about the discovery aired in Germany. A 78-year-old man sat alone, watched it, and recognized everything on the screen. His name was Herbert Guski, and he had served aboard U-869 and was the sole surviving crew member, but he had not sailed on its final mission. Days before the submarine left port, he collapsed with double pneumonia and pleurisy. Doctors hospitalized him and the submarine sailed without him. The boat never returned. For 54 years, Guski did not know what happened to his crewmates. He did not know where they died. He did not know where the submarine was. Then that night, he turned on his television and saw divers exploring the wreck of the submarine he had trained on. I just sat still on the chair and kept wiping the tears. I told myself to look away. Don't look at their blood and bones, but I just couldn't look away from my brothers. My brothers, Herbert said in an interview. When the program showed the knife carved with the name Henberg, Herbert broke down. He knew Martin Henberg well. They had worked together in the radio room. They had lived side by side inside that submarine. He told the interviewer that Henberg was quietly capable, well-liked, the kind of man who kept to himself, but who everyone trusted. Then his voice changed and he said something nobody in that room forgot. He said the discovery stirred everything inside him again. He had started having nightmares. He revealed that Martin Henberg had a daughter. She had been an infant when the submarine sailed. She grew up without knowing who her real father was. She only learned the truth when she turned 18, and her grandmother finally told her. Years later, Richie Kohler tracked her down and placed the knife in her hands. After half a century, the submarine finally had its name. Yet the sailor finally had his story returned to his family, the weapon that came back. Now, investigators knew the submarine's name. But knowing the name only sharpened the question that had been sitting underneath everything from the very beginning. What had actually destroyed U-869? Whatever had torn that hole through the control room and thrown 60 men around the inside of the submarine like ragdolls had done it without leaving a single entry in the official history of the war. So Chatterton and Kohler took the damage evidence to naval weapons experts and started working backwards from the wreck itself. The answer they arrived at was genuinely horrible. Late in the war, Germany had developed a new type of torpedo called the T-5 Zaunkönig, an acoustic homing weapon designed to hunt enemy ships by tracking the sound of their engines through the water. The torpedo would lock onto the loudest noise nearby and chase it. It was considered one of the most advanced weapons either side had produced. Once fired, the torpedo did not simply travel in a straight line. It searched, it listened, it followed the loudest propellers it could detect. Even if a ship tried to turn away, the torpedo could adjust its course and continue hunting. On paper, the weapon looked brilliant, but it had a terrifying flaw. If the torpedo lost its target lock or malfunctioned after firing, it did not simply run straight and exhaust itself. It circled. It kept searching for the loudest sound in the water around it. And in the silence of the open Atlantic, with no enemy ship nearby, the loudest sound available was the vessel that had just fired it, its own submarine. This was not a theoretical danger. It had happened before. The American submarine USS Tang was destroyed on October 24, 1944, when one of its own torpedoes circled back and struck the aft torpedo room. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. Most of the crew died in seconds. The commanding officer survived and confirmed exactly what had happened. A weapon fired in attack had hunted the sound of its own mothership and killed her. The Tang's crew had 20 seconds between firing and impact. 20 seconds to watch their own torpedo turn in the water and come back for them. The evidence from U-869 pointed to the same nightmare. The damage to the control room was consistent with a torpedo strike from outside the hull. A direct, concentrated impact, rather than the wide, crushing pressure of a depth charge. The internal devastation, the scattered remains, the equipment torn from its mountings matched the pattern of a single massive detonation at that precise point. Weapons experts who examined the photographs and the physical evidence told Chatterton and Kohler that U-869 almost certainly fired a T-5 acoustic torpedo at a target, watched it leave the tube, and then had no warning at all before it came back. The crew of U-869 built the weapon that killed them. They loaded it. They aimed it. They fired it. And then it turned in the dark water and found them instead. But here is where the story fractures into something unresolved and deeply unsettling. But the nightmare did not end with that explosion. because other sailors inside the submarine were still alive. And what happened to them next was far worse: the men who never came home. The explosion that tore through U-869 did not kill everyone. That is the part that is hardest to sit with. The torpedo struck the control room and destroyed it instantly. The forward compartments flooded within seconds, but the watertight doors separating the rear of the submarine from the front held. The engine room, the aft quarters, the rear torpedo room. Those sections stayed sealed, and inside them men were still alive. They would have felt the explosion before they heard it. A shockwave that slammed through the steel hull and threw men off their feet. Then the sound. Then the terrible sensation of the submarine tilting, nose down, beginning its final descent toward the ocean floor. Every sailor aboard U-869 had trained for emergencies. Every one of them understood immediately what the angle of the deck beneath their feet meant. They were sinking, and nobody was coming. Escape from a submarine at that depth without decompression equipment means death. The pressure outside the hull at 230 feet would kill an unprotected person within seconds of the hatch opening. There was no rescue possible from the surface. Sealed air in a space that size can last for hours. That means some of those men may have been alive down there long after the submarine stopped moving, sitting in the dark, listening to the ocean pressing against the hull around them, knowing with complete certainty what was coming and having nothing to do but wait for it. They were in their 20s, most of them boys really sent to the bottom of the Atlantic in a steel tube, and the last thing they ever experienced was darkness and the haunting sound of the ocean. U-869 still rests on the ocean floor 60 miles off New Jersey. The remains of the crew are still inside. The submarine corrodes slowly year by year as the ocean takes it apart piece by piece. One day the hull will collapse completely and the sand will swallow what is left. There will be nothing to mark where 60 men spent their final hours. No grave, no marker, nothing. Just the cold Atlantic sitting on top of them the same way it has for 80 years.